What is the creepiest historical fact you know? The ancient Gauls used to collect the heads of their fallen foes and would display them in their homes. Particularly worthy opponents would have their heads embalmed in cedar oil to preserve them so they could be displayed for years. In 1878, a Plains Cree American native named Swift Runner killed and ate his family. He accounts for one of many recorded cases of Wendigo psychosis, a mental illness, or is it related to the Wendigo myth where people believe themselves to become possessed by a Wendigo and suffer from an irresistible craving for human flesh. Starting in 1764, in Gévaudan, France, a creature reported as a gigantic wolf with blood-red fur killed as many as 113 people, and injured many more. Some were eaten, but some were killed and left to rot. Some victims were decapitated, and others had their clothing ripped off. The problem was serious enough that Louis XV took notice and dispatched professional hunters to find the beast. It was finally killed by a hunter named Jean Chassel, who used a silver bullet to deliver the killing blow. Long ago, when samurai were common, they would loudly announce their names before killing their target. They did this so that no other warriors could claim their kill, since everyone in the area would have heard them say their own name. Sometimes after beheading their enemy, they'd keep the head and sell it to a shogun for proof of their job, and since heads were worth so much sen, thieves would often break into rich homes to steal severed heads. In England, during the 1800s, some cemeteries were filling fast, so coffins were stacked on top of each other. Some previously buried coffins were smashed and smooshed to make them all fit. Some of the grave diggers contracted diseases from handling diseased corpses. 3 years ago, I discovered my fourth great-grandfather was buried in an old cemetery in a town I lived in. The cemetery has no headstones, records were lost. Many years ago, a road was built over a section of it. The road is behind a McDonald's store, and looking at maps, part of the McDonald's car park may also be part of the cemetery. I have driven over that road and into that car park so many times to go through drive-through. I may have driven over an ancestor to buy fast food. I haven't been haunted by him yet, so that's nice. Lavrenti Beria, notorious head of the NKVD in the Soviet Union, was a serial rapist. He essentially used his position in the government to commit an untold amount of crimes, often making the women comply by saying that their relatives in the Gulag system would be executed. However, he already knew that the girl's family was long since dead. After raping a woman, guards would offer a flower to her to signify it was consensual. If the woman refused the flower, she was immediately arrested. Then there's the case of a prominent pioneers, Soviet version of the Boy Scouts, leader who was a notorious pedophile/child murderer, who recorded some of his crimes for later watching. Those are online. Sir Hugh Despenser the Younger was punished for backing the wrong nobles in a power struggle, with execution by torture while tied near the top of a ladder leaning against an urban building while a crowd of onlookers watched. The torturer was a surgeon who had to stand near the top of an adjacent ladder while surgically cutting out Sir Hugh's liver. There's an actual _painting_ of this called The Execution of Sir Hugh Despenser the Younger. You can't make this shit up. The story of Delphine LaLaurie. Literally terrifying what she did. She would always host house parties, and at every single party she would end up going upstairs and coming down in a completely different dress, and nobody knew why until the house caught on fire on day. She was caught with slaves suffering through some of the worst torture imaginable. The story is actually really interesting. The show American Horror Story covers it in a very enticing way. But Delphine's home still remains in New Orleans, and you can actually tour it. Unit 731, a Japanese POW research and experimentation camp in World War II. Crazy stuff, including but not limited to live vivisection, deliberately infected people with STDs for observation of genital degradation, making new strains of the bubonic plague, weaponizing cholera, smallpox, botulism, anthrax, typhoid, and targeting California with plague fleas and porcelain bombs. Additionally, testing these on Chinese peasants, they killed over 400,000 people. Human targets were used to test grenades positioned at various distances and in various positions. Flamethrowers were tested on humans. Humans were also tied to stakes and used as targets to test pathogen-releasing bombs, chemical weapons, and explosive bombs, as well as bayonets and knives. In other tests, subjects were deprived of food and water to determine the length of time until death, placed into high-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from the sockets, experimented upon to determine the relationship between temperature, burns, and human survival, electrocuted, placed into centrifuges and spun until death, injected with animal blood, exposed to lethal doses of X-rays, subjected to various chemical weapons inside gas chambers, injected with seawater, and burned or buried alive. Some tests had no medical or military purpose at all, such as injecting horse urine into prisoners' kidneys or amputating limbs and resewing them to other stumps on the body. They also froze limbs, shattered them, and thawed them out to observe the effects of frostbite. Horrifying, but worth the read. This guy, I think his last name was Jesty, saw that milkmaids were not getting the smallpox way back when. He believed it was because they had all gotten the cowpox earlier in life. To prove this, he got some pus from an infected cow and paid a guy to infect his son. He infected him by using a small lance to insert the pus into the poor kid. After the kid was through with cowpox, this Jesty guy exposed him to smallpox, which killed or disfigured you at the time. All to which this kid's dad was like, "I don't care, you paid me." Well, that kid didn't get sick, and so the first vaccine test was conducted. Not really a creepy historical fact, but cool nevertheless. After a Roman general was successful on a long campaign, it was common for him to throw a military tribute, throwing coins minted with the generals' faces and throwing games with bread and wine. This was to celebrate themselves, but also to further their celebrity status. As a buffer, the Senate would appoint a slave that would stand behind the general during the whole military parade, holding an olive wreath above his head. The slave would constantly repeat, "Remember that you are only mortal." A slight fuck you to remind the general that the Senate is the true authority. The faint young sun paradox or faint young sun problem describes the apparent contradiction between observations of liquid water early in Earth's history and the astrophysical expectation that the sun's output would be only 70% as intense during that epoch as it is during the modern epoch. Water could not exist as liquid at the temperatures that existed then. Therefore, how did life emerge, develop, and how are we here now, when there could not have been any water to develop life? Then who is phone? During the Pascal B nuclear test, a 900 kilogram, 2,000 pounds, steel plate cap, a piece of armor plate, was blasted off the top of a test shaft at a speed of more than 66 kilometers per second, 41 miles per second, 240,000 kilometers per hour, 150,000 miles per hour. Before the test, experimental designer Robert Brownlee had estimated that the nuclear explosion, combined with the specific design of the shaft, would accelerate the plate to approximately 6 times Earth's escape velocity. The plate was never found, and it is sometimes claimed that Dr. Brownlee believes that the plate left the atmosphere. However, he himself refutes this claim. The plate was instead vaporized by compression heating of the atmosphere due to its high speed. The calculated velocity was sufficiently interesting that the crew trained a high-speed camera on the plate, which unfortunately only appeared in one frame, but this nevertheless gave a very high lower bound for its speed. After the event, Dr. Brownlee described the best estimate of the cover speed from the photographic evidence as going like a bat out of hell. That one time we used a nuke to launch an entire ton of tank armor into the sky, at some unknown speed too fast to be measured by equipment specifically designed to clock objects moving at 6 times Earth's escape velocity, immediately after which it literally ceased to exist. In short, how many of our ancestors were born from women being kidnapped, sold and raped? Probably more than any of us care to really know. Human trafficking has been a huge part of human history, and most of it has been sexually motivated. Many wars and migrations were motivated in part by human trafficking. Think of the Mongols and Vikings. To paraphrase anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon, most of human existence has been a chronic and sometimes violent competition to obtain nubile, young females. In pre-agricultural societies, which counts for most of human history for the past 300,000 years, conflict between bands and tribes was over resources such as water, hunting grounds, obsidian, and all too often, women. Especially young, fertile women. One example is the site of the Crow Creek Massacre in South Dakota, where in the mid-14th century the population of a fortified village were all killed by marauding nomadic tribesmen from the surrounding area. Well, not all were killed. The skeletal remains were lacking young women. Everyone else was killed and their remains left to rot, while the girls had been carried off by the raiders. As far as material goods, there probably was very little that would have motivated the raiders to conduct such a violent raid. They were there for the girls. Such a scene was probably repeated uncountable times over the millennia. Even in recorded history, much of it has to do with people being rounded up and sold into slavery. Throughout much of the 9th and 10th centuries, humans were trafficked from the steppes of Asia, Northern and Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan African and other peripheral areas into the urbanized world of the Mediterranean, Middle East, Indian, and China. Mostly the first two. Entire tribes were enslaved. Not so long ago, when the Catholic Church were really, Really big cunts. They wouldn't let newborns/kids who died without being baptized be buried the normal way like anyone else is. Instead they wrapped up their tiny little corpses, and buried them in mass pits up and down the country. Ireland, north and south. In Belfast City Cemetery there's a large plot of land with a load of trees planted to mark where a few thousand kids were buried, no headstones, nothing. And just across the way in the bog meadows they found remains belonging to more kids as well. There's a really dark but good podcast about the tomb graves and how the tiny bodies were discovered. It involves a few kids falling into a pit, finding the bodies, taking the skull of one and using it as part of their Halloween costume if I remember correctly. Exploding dog incident. In the early 1960s, which was sort of a peak for Cold War weirdness, it got in the head of someone at the University of Chicago to do an experiment on the effect of gamma radiation on organic flesh. The boys at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, obliged by killing a bunch of dogs with radiation and then packing and sealing them in 55-gallon drums. A courier was dispatched with the drums on a flatbed truck. So this courier was bringing these irradiated dogs through Clarksville on up to Chicago, O'Brien said, and he had a girlfriend that worked at a little hamburger stand that was at the corner of Craft and Riverside. So he pulls in for lunch on a July day in Clarksville, and he and his girlfriend decided to have more than a burger, and he leaves the truck. July heat in Clarksville and 55-gallon drums filled with irradiated dogs left to cook in the sun just has to be a bad combination, with unfortunate results sure to follow. The pressure and the heat inside the drums just kept building up, O'Brien continued, and a couple of them exploded. You had these irradiated dog parts on the corner there, and a Clarksville base Broken Arrow team came and cleaned up the mess and made sure the public didn't find out about it. The dog parts were buried on Clarksville base at a location known to the Tennessee EPA. It was a real Cold War nuclear accident, and it happened here in Clarksville. And now, at long last, you know. Not so much a fact as it is an observation, but people have had allergies for as long as there have been people. It's just that for a long time they weren't understood and people were just like, yeah, I don't know what happened to Jimmy, he just ate a shrimp and then he started making these weird gasping noises and fell over dead. Or sorry, I can't go out right now. Every spring I seem to get this weird cold that just goes away after a week or so. So just imagine all the crazy shit we don't actually have to put up with right now, but we're just too stupid to realize it. Pioneer cookbooks have recipes for adipocere. Adipocere, if you don't know, is when the fat in a human body is converted to adipose tissue or graveyard wax. In hard times graves would be dug up so that the adipocere could be found and eaten. Although the old cookbooks don't highlight where to find adipocere, the songs from that time period make it very clear that it was from human graves. If you have never smelled adipocere, imagine 100 pounds of the strongest blue cheese on earth and now put that in a giant used diaper and leave it in a hot car for a few weeks.